Welcome to EntryPoint. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Patti Miller, the managing editor of Encyclopedia Virginia, and I'm thrilled to be hosting today's EntryPoint, where we take a deep dive into the latest Encyclopedia Virginia entries with the contributors who wrote them. Today, we'll be talking about a really fascinating but little known event, surprisingly, in Virginia history, Benedict Arnold's raid on Richmond. For those of you who aren't familiar with Encyclopedia Virginia, we're a free, reliable, multimedia online resource that tells the inclusive history of Virginia for anyone looking to understand how the past informs the present and the future. You can access all the entries we'll be talking about today, including our most recent entry on Arnold's raid on Virginia at encyclopediavirginia.org. And I'm also dropping a link to our brand new entry into the chat so you can check that out after today's event. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. You'll see a Q&A feature on the lower right-hand side of your screen. As we go through our presentation this afternoon, please think of questions for our host, our presenter today, Amy, and we will get to those questions. Everyone will have a chance to talk to her and ask her directly about some of the history we'll be talking about today. There's also at the lower right-hand side of your screen a closed captioning feature if you do want to turn closed captioning on. So let's get started. I'm really pleased to introduce our guest today, Amy Pflugrad-Jackisch, who is a professor and department chair in the history department at the University of Toledo and the author of Brothers of a Vow, Secret Fraternal Organizations and the Transformation of White Male Culture in Antebellum Virginia. That's a fascinating title, Amy. Welcome, Amy, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So we're going to get started, and I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully that will work out for everybody. Let's see where we are. There we go. Okay, here we go. All right, that is not going to work right now. Okay, well, for some reason, my computer does not want to share my screen today. It's not being cooperative. Let me see if I put this on another screen, if that will work. Sometimes the best laid plans do not work. Okay. You know what I'm going to do? We're going to get started. And Julia, who is also on with us, I'm going to send you this document, Julia, and see if you can open that on your screen, because your screen seems to be a little happier about screen sharing than mine is today. So let's try that. But meanwhile, let's get started. So we're going to start, Amy, in 1776. In 1776, Benedict Arnold is a colonel in the colonial army. By the time we're talking about, which is now 1781, well into the Revolution, he is now a brigadier general in the British military. So, for people who refresh people's history a little bit here, how did we go from having Benedict Arnold be a colonel in the colonial army to being in the British military?
Well, he was actually considered to be a hero in the Continental Army and was revered for some of his previous battles, but he was injured and then made kind of the the temporary governor of Philadelphia after the British left in 1778. And while he was there, that is when he married Margaret Shippen, who becomes his wife and of some ill repute, which may or may not be fair. But anyway, he becomes involved. He's very unhappy because he feels as though he's been passed up for promotions and opportunities in the Continental Army. And so he makes an agreement with John Andre, his friend in the British military, and he agrees to exchange information. He's made the commander of West Point then. That's his next step in New York. And he agrees to give information about the Continental Army and troops to the British. And eventually, many of you probably do know the story that Andre is captured and hanged, but Benedict Arnold escapes. He escapes to New York, and then he is commissioned by Henry Clinton, who's the commander in chief of the British Army at the time, and given his first mission, which is to go to Virginia. And in 1780, so his invasion of Virginia that we're talking about today occurs in January of 1781. He leaves New York in December of 1780. But by September, he's published a letter of explanation for his treason in the newspapers. People in Virginia by October are all in an outrage about it and have published articles in the newspaper about the traitor Arnold. And so they do know who he is. And by that time, they know who Benedict Arnold is and that he is now a traitor and working for the British.
So now take us up to December 31st, 1781. This is New Year's Eve. And what suddenly appears in the Chesapeake Bay on New Year's Eve of 1781?
Right. Then 27, he leads a mission of a variety of different British soldiers, units, and they show up in 27 boats. Such ships, I guess I should say. 27 sail is the technical term that they used in the letters describing his arrival in Chesapeake Bay. And someone from the Virginia Navy actually is the first to spot the ships, and they tell another guy who's a merchant who's around the bay. He tells someone from the Virginia militia, who immediately goes to Thomas Jefferson, who is in his garden in his governor's residence in Richmond. And some of the less kind accounts of this make it seem as though Jefferson's like, no big deal, I'm sure, because there had been British ships that had entered Chesapeake Bay on and off, who had made plundering raids or just like kind of scouting out the location, had come in to check out Portsmouth. And so I think he thought this was a foraging party at first. He didn't take it maybe as seriously as he should have. On December 31st. But he did empower Thomas Nelson, who was the head of the Virginia militia, to call out, militia in certain counties just in case. But then he receives a letter from George Washington, and he begins to think, well, maybe this is a little bit more serious than we thought. And the next step is a couple days later, some of these ships then show up near Jamestown, and then they know, oh, now we really have to move. And Jefferson swings into action and calls out the militia.
And just to set the stage a little bit here, the militia at this time is not that. There's been a lot of resistance to some of the militia callouts. The war's been going on for a while. A lot of the militiamen are farmers and have farms to take care of. So how formidable was the Virginia militia at this time, I guess is the question.
I think that there was varying levels of enthusiasm for the war by then, because as you mentioned, now it's 1781. The war began really in Virginia in 1775. You have Lord Dunmore's proclamation and then the burning of Norfolk in 1776. But after that, after Norfolk and Dunmore evacuate in 1776, it's kind of quiet in Virginia, and people are being drafted and pulled to fight in the Continental Army, but the local Virginia militia are kind of, not only are many of them disaffected because they want to be at home with their families, but they're not really prepared. They don't have a lot of weapons. They have a lot of enthusiasm. They don't have a lot of resources. And Jefferson, as the governor, has had horrible time trying to find arms for them, find supplies for them, and resources for them.
He does call out the militia. He's not, as you say, he will, and we'll talk about this some more. He does get a lot of flack for not moving quickly enough, and that does haunt him for the rest of his career. But let's move on now. So they see the ships, they call out some militia. There's only so much militia they can position at this time. So then by January 4th, he is up the James, and tell us what happens on January 4th.
Well, just to give a little background, what I think is really interesting and kind of like to bring people to that moment of what it was like was on January 2nd, when Jefferson realizes, first of all, he realizes at that point, Washington tells him it's Benedict Arnold. And so he knows that. But also, they're not really sure where he's going. So there have been some speculations about maybe he's going to Petersburg. And they go to a place called Hood's Point, and which is now in Prince George County. And so that, because it's on the south side of the James, they think, well, maybe he's going to Petersburg. But then on January 4th, he lands at Westover Plantation early in the morning. And it's at that moment that they know then he must be going to Richmond, the people who are watching. And so here comes Benedict Arnold with 1,200 British soldiers pulling up to Westover Plantation. And this is the home of Mary Willing Byrd, who is the widow of Colonel William Byrd III, the last William Byrd of Westover. And she lives there with her 8 children and 100 enslaved people. And for all accounts point to the fact that she too had no idea that they were coming. But he likely chose that spot because of the depth of the water near the plantation, that he could get those big ships in there and disembark all of his troops and all of their equipment. And then also, if for those of you who know where Westover is now, it's on that Route 5 plantation drive between Williamsburg and Richmond. And that road, what's now Route 5, he could bring his troops and march them to Richmond from there quite easily.
And you also, as you note in our entry, this was a major tobacco plantation. So it had docks, it had a deep water harbor, it had a extensive grounds where he could encamp his troops. So he just basically takes over Westover Plantation. Now he is related to Mary Byrd by marriage. Let's talk about that a little bit, but you don't believe they had ever met each other before this particular event.
I don't. And I'm a little grumpy about some of the, just because I feel like it's based on myth that has been passed down for 200 years. And so Peggy Shippen is Mary Willing Byrd's, I always get this confused, second cousin once removed. It's her cousin's daughter. So she left Philadelphia in 1760 or 1761 and moved to Virginia and had only been back a couple times. And I think Peggy Shippen was a toddler at the time. And so they couldn't have known each other. But also there's no way, she may have known they were married. She probably kept up with her family, the comings and goings that he had married her second cousin once removed. But I don't believe that there's no evidence to suggest that they had ever met each other or that she had even ever met Peggy Shippen. So, but people have made a lot about that perhaps he landed at Westover because it was family. There's an account that particularly irritates me that describes in great detail how she welcomed Arnold with open arms and said, "How is dear Peggy? Come sit at my table and let me make you a fine breakfast," which, I think in reality, she was probably terrified, as many women would be. The family accounts say that she piled her daughters, in particular, her teenage daughters, into a wagon and tried to move them up the country because of all of the bad things that we can imagine that would happen to teenage girls with all of those soldiers around. So I think she was in a very vulnerable position, even if
And
she
she could
may have
not,
had British sympathies.
and she couldn't say no. It was not a matter of she was
Yeah.
welcoming Arch. He was there with all his troops. They pulled up to her docks, and people far and wide around her, all her neighbors started fleeing once that happened. They were all terrified to have these soldiers all of a sudden in their midst. So they camp at Westover, and they by the 5th, I guess overnight, they're marching towards Richmond.
They land at Richmond between 9 and 10 in the morning, and then by 3 o'clock they actually are on the march to Richmond, and they arrive around 11 a.m. on the 5th.
And so then what happens when they arrive in Richmond? And we should note that at the time, because the capital had moved from Williamsburg to get away from, being surrounded by water, basically, at this point, Jefferson is living in Richmond. The capital has been moved to Richmond. I think he's renting a house. There is no formal, governor's residence, but this is the capital of Virginia at this point and the home of a significant amount of both military and private stores.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Arnold, while he's at Richmond, he actually collects what he calls reliable local guides, which are enslaved people who know the roads and they know how to move around and how to avoid maybe particular authorities. And so one of the people who helps him is a man named Walter Harris, who is the enslaved valet from Westover, and he becomes his personal guide, and he goes with him. And so Arnold brings all of his troops. They march up towards Richmond. They actually encounter very little resistance. And James Madison and a guy named Richard Meade, a comment with disgust, after this has occurred, that like not a shot was fired against them, that they had such little resistance, but it wasn't for want of spirit, but lack of resources. And so when they get to Richmond, Arnold stops in Richmond, and another a guy named John Simcoe, who is the leader of what's called the Queen's Rangers. And if anyone has watched the show Turn, then they know who John Simcoe is. And I would like to also stick up for him and say that in real life, I don't think he was as big of a jerk as he's made out to be in the show, but he was a leader of British troops and had a job to do. And so he goes directly to Westham, which is a foundry there that had been supplying the Continental Army, and him and his men and the cavalry completely destroy that foundry. And Arnold kind of takes headquarters in what's called Galt's Tavern at the time. And his troops actually encamp at St. John's Church, which is where Patrick Henry gave his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. And they proceed to threaten the public. I'm not sure how much detail you want me to go into. They find that there's 30 or 40 ships that are just filled with goods, like tobacco that was going to go out to different places. And so they tell the people there that if you can move that stuff down to our fleet at Westover, we'll let you keep half the value. But if you don't, then we're going to lay waste to all the warehouses and all the different valuable sites in Richmond. And so the people who are the merchants who are not able to move they can't do it without the governor's permission. And so they go ask Jefferson, can we move these ships down the river? And Jefferson's like, absolutely not. We're not doing that. Don't even respond to him. And so they don't reply to Arnold. And he says, I told you, sorry. And then he proceeds to burn huge amounts of warehouses and supplies all throughout Richmond and wreak havoc there.
And of course, this is psychologically a huge blow. This is the British Army in the heart of Virginia, plundering both private and public stores at this point. So psychologically, what effect do you think this had on the Patriot effort to know that they've just kind of walked into Richmond so easily? I mean, a good part of the Continental Army is still further south at this point.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, Jefferson, as soon as he realizes that they're coming to Richmond, he puts his family in a carriage and sends them to Tuckahoe Plantation. And an enslaved man who belonged to Jefferson makes a comment about how there wasn't a white man found in Richmond. Yeah, Isaac Granger Jefferson. And he was just a little boy at the time, and he describes what it was like. He was playing in the yard of the governor's residence when the British came, and his mother came and scooped him up. But his family and another one of the families that was owned by the Jeffersons were taken by the British, and they were taken captive by them. And so I think psychologically for both white and black people who were living in Richmond at the time, that it was absolutely terrifying. One of the German soldiers who's traveling with the British, a guy named Johann Ewald, he also he estimated that 2/3 of the British soldiers were drunk, because when they went to individual homes, they went to like the warehouses and different businesses, they found alcohol, and continued then on the night of the 6th, which is the day that they basically plundered Richmond. And they all enjoyed themselves with that alcohol. And by the time they were done, apparently they were terribly drunk. And he notes in his memoirs that he says, quote, terrible things were done. And he doesn't say what they are, but there was a lot of plundering. And he mentions that some churches were even plundered.
And much like the burning of Norfolk several years earlier, which was completed by the Patriots but begun by the British, the British commanders seems had very little incentive to stop these drunken troops from marauding. It was a form of terror to bring to the populace that had not answered their call to deliver the supplies to them. Let's talk a little bit, as you mentioned in the entry, this was a time of both terror and opportunity for the enslaved Black population in the area. Opportunity because several years earlier, Lord Dunmore had issued his proclamation offering freedom to any people who were enslaved by patriots who would fight for the British. So there's that opportunity to go to British lines. You talk about one of the servants at Westover who became a guide for Benedict Arnold. Isaac Granger's family, however, was basically taken prisoner and held captive. Was that just something that was done to the enslaved people who belonged to prominent patriots, or why were some people kind of captured and some people brought under the protection of the British Army?
I think in particular it was probably a feather in Arnold's cap to capture the enslaved people who were at the governor's residence. But even at Westover, for example, Watt Harris, that's what he went by, Watt Harris, that he joined them intentionally, and he ended up being like, because I think he believed Lord Dunmore's proclamation had made, and then later something called the Phillipsburg Proclamation had made a real impact on the enslaved communities in Virginia and all over the South. That this opportunity, if the British came to where you were, if you could run behind British lines, that you could somehow get your freedom. And then particularly for enslaved men, I think that the opportunity to fight in the army, they were paid, and not all of, oftentimes they were put in jobs that were not fighting. But with Lord Dunmore's proclamation, that was not the case, and they were actually formed in what's called the Royal Ethiopian Regiment. And so at the time, I think there was an expectation among enslaved men that if they could go and do that, that they would gain their freedom. In addition to taking refuge behind British lines, I think that they're also, the chaos of the moment gave enslaved people the opportunity also to just gain their freedom. But when Arnold and his men are marching back from Richmond towards Westover, where they're going to like stop and rest, there are people flocking to them and joining them because they think that they can gain their freedom. While at the same time, there are opportunities. Enslaved people were property, under the law. And so I think there was also, that was part of the plundering, is taking property away.
Taking wealth away from the
Right.
patriots.
Into
So
private labor.
so now they returned to Westover for a period of time, and then they marched towards Charles City Courthouse. But here, some enslaved people play a role in aiding the British again as guides. So tell us about their role there.
So when Arnold and his men go back to Westover, Simcoe finds out from an enslaved person who had escaped on the road that the Continental, or that the Virginia militia had 200 to 300 men at Charles City County Courthouse, which was only 2 miles from Westover, and that they were kind of hiding in the forest near there. And so Simcoe takes a bunch of cavalry, and this enslaved man leads them back, shows them how to go through the back roads, and they surprise the Virginia militia that are there, and actually are able to, disperse them and beat them in a skirmish. And so, although none, I don't believe any Virginia militia were killed, one British soldier was killed. But I think that what's significant about that is that and many of the other smaller examples that I've just mentioned, is that the really important role that the enslaved community played in this moment, that, we don't think of the American Revolution, I don't think, oftentimes as kind of something that's taking place on the home front, because we think of wars, more recent wars, as being something that happens far away, or even the Civil War we think of as being different. But this was a war at home, in people's homes, around people's grounds, and enslaved communities who were there played a really key role in either fighting for the Americans or fighting for the British or escaping and gaining their freedom. And one of the most important things they did, I think, was to feed information to troops on both sides. Like you have James Fayette, who fed information to the Americans. And it was
And
really
this
important.
And this was a significant disadvantage for the British. They would not know how to maneuver around the countryside there. They could go up and down the James quite easily, but once they got into the countryside, the mapping was very rudimentary at the time. So having
Mhm.
these local guides who could guide them or tell them, oh, there's militia ahead, this becomes a big factor in this episode. You combine that with the fact that the militia is very undermanned. There's not a lot that's going to stop the British at this point.
Mhm.
So tell us what happens. So they're at Charleston City Courthouse on the 8th, and then where do they proceed from there?
Then they embark back on their ships at Westover, and they move back down the James towards, what would you call it, south, down the James towards the opening, down towards the bay. And they're on their way to Portsmouth. So Arnold's objectives that he was given by Henry Clinton were to destroy the foundry at Westham, so they couldn't continue to supply the Continental Army from there. But the second thing that he was supposed to do was to establish kind of a headquarters or a base at Portsmouth. And so that's now what he's going to be going and doing. He lands down by Flower Dew 100, and then he drops down even farther towards Smithfield, and he then gets out and goes overland to Princess Anne County, and he goes into Portsmouth then to try to establish that headquarters. And what's kind of interesting is the British are imagining, because that was the Loyalist stronghold in 1775 and 1776, that they would be welcomed as victors. I think we've heard that before. They would be welcomed as liberators, that the enslaved or the Loyalist population would help them then to establish. But they didn't find that. They did go and try to, Arnold makes a big production where he goes into Princess Anne County, and he puts on basically a big barbecue, and he asks the people to come out and sign this loyalty oath to the British. And there are people who do, men and women both come out and do it. It's not clear if it's because they're loyalists or if it's because they want the food or if it's because they're afraid. Again, Johann Ewald, who always has all sorts of cutting comments, the German soldier who's traveling with the British, says, people pretended to be their friends because he was giving them a big meal and having this big party there. But the British are disappointed at the turnout of loyalists, but he's able to successfully establish that base at Portsmouth. And really, and that becomes the base for the British Army in some ways up all the way until September, when the British are using that area. And Arnold, once he's done with his job, then he goes back to New York once he's successfully established that base.
And talk a little bit. I mean, this seems to have been, Arnold, obviously he's betrayed the Patriot cause, and he's told the British that there's going to be this groundswell of support if I can get into these loyalist strongholds, especially in the Bay areas that had always had a lot of loyalist merchants and people who probably weren't that excited about the revolution in a lot of ways. And yet he goes there and finds very little. It's fairly late in the war at this point, but finds very little support for what he had been kind of telling the British was a thing, that there was going to be this. They were just really waiting for the safety of the arrival of the British military to, turn sides again. So does this damage his reputation, his credibility, do you think, with the British, that this doesn't really happen, that he kind of has talked up?
I don't know as much about what happens to him after the revolution, but I do know that there were a lot of British military officers who were very suspicious of him. I mean, always, because he had betrayed the Americans. And so even though he was doing work for them at the time, they never quite really trusted him. And so I think, I'm not sure if they blamed him specifically for that, but that he was never really somebody that they put all of their faith in.
So he's there through April. New reinforcements are brought in. He returns to New York. There's obviously embarrassment on the part that there's been very little credible resistance made to the British arrival. But there's also side effects for other folks who, who've been here, who are now living with this occupation. Mary Bird, especially, talk a little bit about what happens to her. She gets caught up in this in a really interesting way that reflects both her status as an enslaver, who she has, inherited her husband's enslaved property, but also as a woman in this very difficult time. Talk a little bit about how she finds herself kind of caught between the British and the Americans.
Well, so as soon as Benedict Arnold and his troops leave her plantation, they completely trashed her plantation. There were destroyed so much of her property, and she's invaded multiple times during the war. So, but she believes that the majority of the 49 enslaved people who ran away from her plantation to seek their own freedom left with Arnold. And so she's very upset because for her as a widow, I think during the war, she's struggling from her perspective as an elite colonial woman. She thinks she's struggling to make ends meet, which I think other people would scoff at that because she obviously had a lot of nice things as well still. But from her perspective, she really felt like she was destitute. The plantation had been devastated. And so because enslaved people were such valuable parts of the property that she owned, she wanted them back. And so she wanted them to be returned to her by the British. And so military people used what were called flags of truce to send goods and messages back and forth across, from the British to the Americans. And so she was able to secure a flag of truce and asked Arnold to send her, because a lot of people, not just her, a lot of people in Virginia thought that the enslaved people who ran away from their plantations were with Arnold in Portsmouth. And so they wanted Arnold to send them back. They wanted permission to go search his camps and to retrieve what they considered to be their property. And so she asked for a flag of truce from Arnold and also from the Americans, and she gets permission to do that. But it goes horribly wrong when, so Arnold tries to then he can't find the enslaved people that were from her plantation. And so he tries to kind of, I think, make her feel better, satisfy her in a way by sending back one of her daughter's riding horses and some other goods that maybe were hard to get during the war. It says it was like china and different kinds of food and like wine. And so he sends all those goods back in this ship. But the Americans stop the ship and they find letters supposedly that were written, these letters have been lost, between Mary Bird and Benedict Arnold. And so then it seems as though she's trading with the enemy to them. And so she's actually accused of treason and put on trial, or a trial is called for her in March of 1781. And supposedly there's no records from the trial, and we don't actually know what happened. It was delayed till March 23rd, but then some people say it didn't take place. Some people say, and her family legend says that she went and defended herself so forcefully that she was able to be freed. And then there's another kind of snarky Virginian named Arthur Lee, who's like, oh, like she just had her and her cronies had the witnesses put out of the way. And so they weren't able to have the trial. But we don't actually know, but she was never convicted of treason as a result.
But as we can see, this is one of the letters she wrote in her defense. She felt, obviously, I mean, especially, I mean, they do not know that the war will end fairly shortly after this, but she's worried
Mhm.
about her reputation in the community. So she's really working hard to defend herself because if she had been seen as a traitor by her fellow people once the war was over, loyalists were not well liked after the war, and many of them were driven out of Virginia.
She says there were efforts made to burn down her plantation, that she was so upset about what she called her honor, and that people had, accused her of betraying her country. And she says, I think that's it says, I've paid my taxes. I've done all the things that like a good American would do. And given she gave a soldier as a substitute for her country. It says that this is, yeah, I paid my taxes. I have not been personally or virtually represented, and my property is taken from me, and I have no redress. And so she's very upset. She's writing to the governor. She's writing to members of the officers in the Continental Army. She eventually writes to British officials, and she's trying to regain her reputation. She says, "What am I but an American? I have, all of my things are here. Why would I betray my country?"
And interesting, like her fellow elite woman, Hannah Lee Corbin, she's complaining here that she's paying taxes because as a widow, she has control of her late husband's property. She is paying taxes on that property, yet she has no representation, much as Hannah Corbin Lee had complained to her brother, Richard Lee, that I'm paying my taxes and we're fighting for this supposedly taxation without representation, yet I do not have any representation in this matter. So it is an interesting glimpse into these women who really saw all the pressures that the male landholders saw without even the hope of representation should the war go their way.
I think what's really interesting, what this episode shows as well, is that she has political agency of her own. She considers herself to be a political being. The way she uses Republican rhetoric, she is obviously very well educated. But I mean, she talks about, I paid my taxes, as that as being something that, they're not using the word citizenship yet. I mean, she's not using the word citizen, but I think by implication, she's saying, I'm a citizen. What that means for her at that moment, I don't think anyone knows what that means for women quite very clearly. But I mean, she's staking her claim that she has individual political agency and that she deserves the protection of her country for that, for her property. But the property also, it's important. I think she says, I've been virtually represented. My property is taken from me. She's not talking about land, right? I mean, she's talking about enslaved people. And so it also highlights the fact that she is an enslaver and that she believes her rights derive not only from paying her taxes, but from her enslaved property.
And it is also interesting that she, as well as the other local enslavers, they assume that the British are holding their enslaved property. And in some cases, they were some of the enslaved people that belonged to Thomas Jefferson were kept near Yorktown for a period. But most of those people who fled the plantations fled under their own power and were seeking protection behind the British lines and whatever freedom they could find there. So it is, as she is complaining about her lack of, representation and agency here, they're completely discounting that the people who fled from them also had the agency to seek better outcomes for themselves.
She later she tries to track. She actually ruthlessly tries to track them down in as far away as New York City as the war is ending. And even writes to Guy Carleton, who is the commander in charge of the evacuation of the British from North America. And she just calls them like these kind of like foolish, delusional people. Like she doesn't understand, like why would they run away? It doesn't seem to really get it. Um,
So the other person who has a kind of a long tail effect from this event is who at the time is Governor Thomas Jefferson. He does not come out smelling great from this. Talk a little bit about Thomas Jefferson and probably the most embarrassing incident of his career.
Right. Well, so during Arnold's raid, I think that most of the criticism that he receives has to do with the fact that he didn't take it seriously on New Year's Eve when people came to tell him. And as I said, there's some secondary accounts that kind of talk about him kind of like lazing around in his garden. Like you can imagine him kind of walking through the garden, smelling flowers, and someone's like, hey, there's all these ships in the bay. What are we going to do about this? And that he's kind of like, let's just see what happens. And he really, even though he does empower the militia to move, he doesn't really do anything specifically. He's waiting for more information. And that, I think, was his mistake. And it's not until it's too late, they're already up by Jamestown in the river, when he decides to call more people into action. And so that delay, he got a lot of criticism from other people, Virginians and others, that he had not properly prepared the state for and with military resources that were needed to combat something like that, but that he had been so late in responding that caused the disaster at Richmond.
And talk a bit about, so he flees Richmond. He puts his family in a carriage. They head to Poplar Forest to be safe. Where is the General Assembly in all this? Where are the other leadership figures of Virginia at this time?
Um, well, they have fled. Everyone flees. Like Isaac Jefferson says that there wasn't a white man to be found in Virginia. But I think you're also thinking about when Banastre Tarleton comes in June, and that so Cornwallis after this. So there's this stain on his reputation. He's already kind of being questioned as being very ineffective military governor. And so then in May, Cornwallis comes up from after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, comes up into Virginia from the south and reunites with some of the troops that Arnold had brought, actually at Westover on May 28th. And then they move Banastre Tarleton, who had been with Cornwallis, breaks off and he goes to Monticello. He rides across in Jack Jewett's famous ride to capture the governor. And so I know this has nothing to do with Benedict Arnold's raid, but I'll just quickly finish the story. But that So when he gets there, Jefferson had been watching through a spyglass, and he sees that they're coming, and he actually flees, and he falls off his horse and sprains his wrist, and he's left enslaved the Hemmings there at Monticello to kind of hold down the fort. And there's stories about it's really interesting stories about the British coming, putting basically a gun to, I think it's James Hemmings' chest, could be Martin, I can't remember which one, but and say, where's the governor, and like he won't give him up. And so those two things end with an inquiry into his conduct. It's the very end of his governorship then at that point by June. In fact, there's a period of time where there is no official governor because his term's expired and the legislature has dissolved and run away. So they don't have time to elect somebody else. And so when they kind of get their act together after that, there's a inquiry into his conduct, and he's censured. He's mortified and upset.
It is not his finest moment. Yeah, not anyone's finest moment. So what's the bigger lesson here? What's the bigger story here, just in terms of the psychological advantage that the British garnered from this? And then, I mean, we will not go into, the continuation of the various British movements throughout the summer of 1781. You can find all about that in Encyclopedia Virginia. But they have this huge psychological advantage. They've sacked Richmond, they've burned public and private property, they've taken lots of military stores or destroyed them, and yet they're not able to carry that advantage out through the rest of the year. So this is kind of a one-off event in some ways.
Right. Well, then the Continental Army, I mean, Washington, this is his home state, right? He sends the Continental Army down with Steuben, and then also General Wayne comes down, Anthony Wayne comes down, and they engage with the British. Then in that summer and the spring, even as early as the spring, they come down. And so, but I think that, as you say, that this was for Virginians, there was, like I said, not as much going on. They were, the war effort was going forward, but there were no battles like on the ground in Virginia at that time. And then all of a sudden, this is like, it blows the door open. And then from that moment on, really, in Virginia, there is constant military conflict all the way up to Yorktown. And it is the like opening salvo. And as you mentioned, the British have a huge psychological advantage in that, because in some ways, the Virginians were caught, by surprise and unprepared.
And then the other question, and if you have other questions for Amy, please drop those in the Q&A chat. Why do you think this raid is not as well known as other parts of both Revolutionary history and the Revolution in Virginia? It is a lesser known factor, even though it has a kind of a marquee name in Benedict Arnold.
I don't really know, because I think it's so interesting. But I do think it's probably because the Virginians were unprepared. It doesn't make Thomas Jefferson look very good. It's not one of those things that people maybe wanted to remember going forward. It's not. Jefferson biographers, I mean, it's in there, but I don't think it's overshadowed by other things that Jefferson did. His governorship, really, a lot of people, except for Duma Malone, I'm thinking of other people who have written about him, don't spend a lot of time on his governorship. And so perhaps that could be why.
He is, I mean, he obviously, both the events at Yorktown and he becomes president. There's other events that overtake his governorship in Virginia.
Mm.
I'm going to drop a link in the chat to our entry on Thomas Jefferson as governor of Virginia for people who want to dig into that a little bit more. And this is you've done a lot of work in this area. This is kind of your specialty, this raid. What kinds of sources were you able to pull from to understand the diverse experiences of people who were involved in this raid, the enslaved, Black people of the Tidewater, the women of the Tidewater? How were you able to pull that story together?
I guess, as you say, I should have been more aware of the fact that people didn't know about this, because I didn't find a lot of secondary sources that were written about it when I went to go do this. And I wrote this almost completely from primary sources they were, the obvious ones are things like Jefferson's papers and letters, where, he's talking about that from the official capacity. But the newspapers of the time were not very helpful. There are a lot of military. I used John from the British side. I think that's also another reason why a lot of people have not used British sources to talk about these raids in Virginia. And so I was able to find things in John Simcoe. He has a memoir that he left. There are papers that are easier for us to access now, I think, digitally, from Henry Clinton. There are some published primary sources in something that's called the naval documents of the Revolution,
Yes.
published some of those things. But for enslaved people, I think, they're always there. They're in Jefferson's papers, like that skirmish at Charles City County Courthouse talks about how there are enslaved people there, who are the ones who tipped off the British to the location of Thomas Nelson and the militia. But I think that when people covered this as a military topic in the past, that they weren't looking for those kinds of things. And so it's the last, 40 or 50 years of scholarship and efforts to recover the experience of enslaved people during the war that have made people like me and others more sensitive to when we see those things in documents. We're like, oh, and then, we take note and start putting together like a puzzle, putting the pieces together to create part of the story that has been happening the whole time, but people didn't really call attention to.
And what you really have called attention to here is the centrality of the experiences of the woman and the enslaved people. They were really the people experiencing this. There was very little military. We didn't mention it, but at Flower-Dew 100, there's a very brief conflict with the militia, but the Virginia militia just has no real ability to stop them. So the actors, if you want to put it that way, who are interacting most day to day and really being a part of this are not the militia. It's not the military. It's the people who live there, are the people who are experiencing this on the day-to-day basis. There is not I don't think there is a Revolutionary War trail of this particular battle either. If you want, you could not, I'm sure I think at Westover, of course, I think there is a historical marker, but there's not a really good marker set of things that you could follow this and say, oh, this is the famous Benedict Arnold raid on Virginia, which is interesting given the centrality of it to then what unfolds over the next 6 months in Virginia.
And they did have a reenactment of I think it was 2021 that they did a reenactment. It was during COVID, so I didn't get to go, but of Benedict Arnold's raid at Westover, which is kind of an interesting thing. I wish I could have seen.
Well, we're almost out of time for today. Thank you so much, Amy. Is there anything else you want to leave folks with about this particular incident in American history?
No, I think that the thing that's important to me is to think of this and the rest of the events that maybe people will talk about the Revolution in Virginia, to think about it not just as a military conflict, because I think that's when people write the history of this, a lot of it is about military battles. But those military battles, yes, they did occur, but they affected more than the soldiers, that it was enslaved people, it was women and families who were living, and it was taking place where they lived on the ground in their home. And Lauren Duvall's new book about, the home front that's recently been published, I think that shows that when you're doing this kind of history, that this history of the war really is not just a history of military battles, that it was really significant and I think laid important groundwork for the things that happened in Virginia after the war is over because of the things that happened during the battles on the ground in Virginia. It helped enslaved people and women and men find like new roles and experience new things that I think catalyzed changes that were already occurring before the war.
And it is interesting to think of that, and I think that's an important point to leave with. It's not the military battles plus the home front. It's really the home front was both part of those battles, but what happened there shaped events of the war just as much as the war shaped events.
Right. And it's not to take away from the military, events either, because those are obviously very important. But I don't think you can really tell that story without including the other. It's holistic.
And it brings in another set of actors that people don't always think about. That's why the Mary Bird story is so interesting because it kind of centers somebody who is both incredibly privileged, but also finds themselves in a position of powerlessness, both vis-a-vis the British Army, but also their own status within the society that they're kind of questioning. So
Mhm.
we will wrap that up for today. Thank you so much, Amy. It is a fascinating part of Virginia history and for sharing that with us today. If you found today's presentation useful, please consider giving to Virginia, Encyclopedia Virginia, dropping a chat in the link. Your donations make it possible for us to present events like this at a time of decreased funding, federal funding for the humanities. You can also keep up to date on all the latest entries from Encyclopedia Virginia by signing up for our newsletter, and I will drop a link to that in the chat as well. And be sure to join us on May 6th for our next entry point on the Albemarle Barracks here in Charlottesville and the POWs held there during the Revolution. Another kind of piece of very local Virginia history that not everyone is familiar with. So we really look forward to talking about that. Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you so much to everybody who joined us today. Bye bye.